morning, everybody. We're getting ready to have storms here. Not yet, but close. Next few days. So before I get started, we're going to talk about the history of the U.S. food pyramid and some science on cholesterol. This is going to be a two-parter, maybe three-parter. Hey, Wendy. And what I'll do, hi, Holly. What I'll do is try to get through this so that it's not like an hour of your time in the middle of the morning. So I always try to do these about 30, 40 minutes, something like that. But before we do, there's not that much, hey Linda, Sarah, there's not that much interaction on a Facebook Live. So I can see your comments. And if there's questions, I usually try to address them, not necessarily always, but so I have things that I want to get through and not make it go on and on and on and on. So, but two things first. One is for an interactive thing, question and answer on Friday. I will be a nurse practitioner and a nutrition and fitness health coach. We'll be joining Wynn Richards, who runs a podcast called the Art of Floundering podcast on Fridays. I think it's 7. We haven't decided that exactly yet. I was going to have a licensed professional counselor who actually came up with the idea. Hi, Randy. And she has conflict, at least this weekend. So the Art of Floundering podcast with Wynn Richards as host. So we'll do this is a Zoom meeting you can join, and then we'll put it on Facebook Live at the same time. He knows how to do that, and I'm not quite that tech savvy yet. Took me a while to figure out how to do this. The other thing is, from doing these, I'm getting, hey Latasha, quite a few consult requests. I'm doing one right after we get done this morning. And I found out I did a test with a client of mine in February who has Medicare. The AMA just made health coaching their own CPT procedural code that went into effect in January. So I wanted to see if health coaching was reimbursable, and at least for Medicare, it is. So I talked to her yesterday as a follow-up, and she said, yeah, I sent my what I paid you in the Medicare, and 3 weeks later I got 75% of it back. So that's exciting for those of us who do health coaching. So I'm assuming that commercial insurance will kind of follow the same lead as Medicare. They usually do. So that's exciting for me, I think. Okay, so let's get into this. So today we're going to talk about the food pyramid, its history, some science behind cholesterol. Hey, Jim. Hey, Eileen. And then on Friday, we're going to talk about statins and heart disease and cholesterol and heart disease and some alternative viewpoints on that. Okay, so statins, I'm going to start out saying a statin thing. So statins, various ones. Lipitor is the one you probably know the most. But there's Mevacor, there's, hey Linda, there's, Crestor, there's a whole bunch of them. Been around 30 years, and they started looking at statins and their effectiveness about 2005. So the health benefits of statins and lower cholesterol levels have come under scrutiny, and on Friday I'm going to prove it to you. So what if the epidemic of heart disease and diabetes type 2 and insulin resistance of the past 40 years, I mean, that's become epidemic. What if it's from the way we were taught to eat? Okay, so I thought, okay, well, let's review how we were taught to eat. I did write this in November. It's a big, long article, and on Friday when I get done, or maybe when I start, I'll put you a link to it, and then you can kind of follow along, because it's fairly sort of intense, but written so that you can understand what I'm talking about, really. Okay, so the last 40 years, and most of my life, I turned 60 this summer, we've had an emphasis placed on high carbohydrate and low fat diets. And despite that recommendation, we have continued to have increasing rates of heart disease mortality. Hey, Kelsey. Hey, Stephanie. And diabetes and insulin resistance and obesity and weight gain. Tammy, thanks for joining. Okay, so I'm going to look at the lack of scientific evidence for the USDA, Department of Agriculture, food recommendations, and show you how this basically came about based on flawed studies. Okay, so what we're going to do is first talk about cholesterol. So it's gotten a bad rap. All you hear about is, ooh, cholesterol's bad, yucky, it's terrible, it's going to hurt you, you're going to have heart attacks and all that. But, and that goes back to when I was in medical school in the 80s at the University of Missouri. So we were taught about cholesterol and biochemistry my first year. And it seemed, like an important thing to know about and have, because it is. Without cholesterol, you would die. We would not function. But even back in the 80s, fat was considered, hey, Brett, considered a bad part of our national diet. So we kept hearing about how low-fat food and how that would help reduce our chances of having heart disease and heart attacks. We were told to eat sugar and carbohydrates in increasing amounts for quick energy, okay, and increase the amount of carbohydrates in our diet. Everybody switched from butter to margarine, and that's the subject of a whole nother Facebook Live that we could do. And this came about right about the time, a little bit after Robert Atkins wrote the Diet Revolution book in 1972. And his viewpoint, and everybody thought he was a nut and he was a quack, he recommended a low carbohydrate, high fat diet for optimal health. Okay, so those in the know about causes of heart disease, most of which comes from the Framingham Heart Study, and we'll talk about that later or maybe Friday, depending on how fast I go through this. Turns out Dr. Atkins, hey Amanda, was actually kind of on the right track. Hi Nancy, hi Richard. And a lot of people thought he died of a heart attack or heart disease. He was 72 when he died. He slipped in Manhattan, New York City on ice, hit his head, and he died from a traumatic brain injury, I think a cerebral hemorrhage. Okay, so it turns out with newer research that lowering cholesterol rates has minimal impact on the development of heart disease. Okay, the recommended goals through my entire career for total cholesterol, low density lipoprotein or LDL cholesterol have been going down. And then just went down again, I think about 5 years ago. So total cholesterol should be under 200 and LDL should be under 100. Well, that's hard to do because, just because it's hard to do. 4 or 5 years ago, it was 150, if I remember right. So now what? What do we do next? All right, so the history of government food recommendations. The first guide to nutritional value and recommendations was published in 1902 by a guy named Wilbur Olin Atwater. He was a PhD, and he founded the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA. Okay, so he focused his research on the caloric value of different types of food and the type of energy that's produced from eating those foods. Okay, so the first USDA recommendation was published in 1917, and it was called How to Select Foods. Okay, so the emphasis of that was grouping food into 5 groups, and the original 5 groups were sugars and fats, cereals, milk and meats were put together in one category. I don't get that. Vegetables and fruit, so that kind of makes sense, although fruits and vegetables are kind of different, okay? Also discussed the discovery of vitamins and minerals, micronutrients that you could obtain from food, okay? That led to the recommended daily allowance, or the RDA. You see it on any supplement you take. And those were developed and published in World War II. And at that time, they categorized food into 7 groups. Hey, Rob, Debbie. Okay, so 7 groups at that time were dairy products. And then this is interesting: meat, poultry, fish, eggs, beans, peas, and nuts. Then bread and flour and cereals. and then green and yellow vegetables, and then potatoes by themselves, and then citrus, tomato, cabbage, salad greens, and butter. And then the seventh was butter fortified margarine. Hey, Dr. Brooks. So then as now, there were all kinds of confusing and contradictory dietary recommendations. Serving sizes were added at that time and published in 1956, so a little bit after World War II. And then they dropped the recommendations and the food groupings from 7 to 4. So in 1956, there were four food groups. Hey, Tammy. Hey, Christy. Milk, meat, fruits and vegetables, and grain products. Okay, so that's 3 changes from 1917. Okay, in 1958, there was a physiologist here in the United States named Ancel Keys, and he began a study, what became known as the 7 countries study. Okay, and his hypothesis of his research was that diets high in saturated fats were the cause of cardiovascular disease, based on the research showing that countries where fat consumption was highest had the most heart disease. Well, that's basically what we've been taught, correct? So it sounds reasonable, makes sense. The problem is he managed to manipulate his data. And he intentionally left out countries where people ate a high-fat diet and have little heart disease. And he also left out countries where dietary fat was low, but heart disease rates were high. Okay, so you remember this from Johnny Cochran: if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And Mr. Keys didn't do that, Dr. Keys. His hypothesis was invalid. Okay, and then we go back to the 60s, and those of us who are old enough remember George McGovern, who ran for president against Nixon in 1972. He was involved in, hey Derek, and Corey, he was involved in a government committee that was trying to eradicate malnutrition in the United States. Okay, so that committee felt that they'd achieved their goal by 1969. Now, whether or not that has anything to do with the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, I don't know. That's a political thing. But they thought they had accomplished eradication of malnutrition. And so they started looking for something else to look at and get funding for. Okay. So Ancel Keys' research had given him some influence with the American Heart Association, who began recommending lower cholesterol and fat consumption for better cardiovascular health, despite the fact that the scientific study that he did was basically invalid. Okay, there's really been no link between the two. Okay, and then they really started looking at, we'll talk about this Friday in 2005, when we talk about statins and cardiovascular disease. Okay, so based on that faulty logic and study, the development of the USDA food pyramid began under the direction of Senator McGovern's committee. And it was, so in 1977, that committee published the first dietary goals for the United States, with the goal of that being to reduce the heart disease epidemic in the United States. Okay, so the basic recommendations from that committee were that Americans should reduce consumption of fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. And they were told to increase carbohydrate consumption to 55 to 60% of total calories and to avoid less refined processed sugar. Okay, well, that one was actually accurate. We'll talk about that again Friday. So the USDA agreed, and the era of the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet was put in place in 1977. Okay, they were of course revised because the agricultural people and the farmers that were growing this food got irritated. So they were revised after the cattle, the egg, and the dairy industries became incensed by the fact that the government was saying that animal products were unhealthy and promoted heart disease. So even after those revisions, so they had dropped, their sales had dropped. So even after the revisions, Americans were eating less meat, eggs, and dairy products, and those industries continued to suffer from those declines in sales and profit, right? Okay, so the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services teamed with the USDA to issue the first dietary guidelines for Americans, which led to the food pyramid development that was published in 1992, so only 28 years ago. So throughout the 80s and the early 90s, the prevailing force behind dietary recommendations was the low-fat, high-carbohydrate concept of good nutritional guidelines, okay? The interesting thing is the food pyramid graphic that you know, and it's been revised, it was revised again in 2016, was obtained from the USDA by copying the food pyramid from Sweden. Okay, and Sweden's heart disease death rate is higher than the United States. Nevertheless, they copied that food pyramid from Sweden and brought it under the, the recommended guidelines for the food pyramid in the United States. Okay, so research studies continue to be done to provide evidence of the health benefits of lower carbohydrate, natural, and whole food diets, including lower natural fat intakes. Hey, Crystal. The crusaders of high carb, lower fat intake prevailed, even in revisions to the pyramid, which occurred in 2010 and 2016. Okay, so scientists at the USDA ignored the research and continued to tout the benefits of a non-research based recommendation. Okay, so we have talked about with the Mikovits thing and all that, evidence-based research and manipulating data and all that. The guy that tried to link autism with vaccines in England lost his medical license for manipulating data, and that's kind of, hey Christy, that's kind of one of the fights with the pandemic video, and we talked about that last Friday. Okay, so basically, if you can't prove it, don't do it. And you can't cheat, you can't fake your data. That's academic dishonesty, and plus it can lead to kind of problems, right? Okay, so I do have a list that I'll do after I go through all the statin research and its effect on cardiovascular disease over the last 30 years. I have a list of 27 health and nutrition tips that are evidence-based, and you're not going to hear them from the USDA or the FDA. So we'll go over that. It's kind of long, so I don't want this to go on today. But Friday at 9:30, we're going to talk about statins, and then I'll give you a personal story of mine and what I did, and then I'll give you those 27 health and nutrition evidence-based tips for staying healthy. Okay, so what does this all mean for cholesterol? Cholesterol's bad. Okay, if the food pyramid is based on faulty science, is the science on cholesterol faulty as well? Well, it turns out it is, and they started looking at it fairly seriously in 2005. Okay, so I know that people think videos, and I guess you could say the same thing about me doing a video rather than writing it. But I watched a video a few years ago by a guy, hey Ross, or on Netflix, it's still on Netflix, it's called Prescription Thugs. And of course, this guy hates the pharmaceutical industry. And he did a video about testosterone overdosing. His brother was a professional wrestler and died when he was 41 from basically doping himself into heart disease. So he did a follow-up, not to that, but called Prescription Thugs. And and despite whether you believe what he says or not, he does interview a woman who is a pharmaceutical sales representative for Pfizer Pharmaceuticals who makes Lipitor. Okay, so in the documentary, she states there were never any studies that showed a lowering of heart disease in patients taking atorvastatin, is the generic name for Lipitor, and that the side effect data was suppressed. Friday, I'm going to prove all that to you, and we're going to go through them all. The potential side effects were not to be discussed with doctors on sales calls, and research papers presented on Lipitor included manipulative statistics favoring the drug. So remember, Mark Twain, lies, damn lies, and statistics. I think I've said that to you guys 5 times already. So Lipitor came on the market in 1996. It wasn't the first statin. The first statin was simvastatin, which is still on the market. It was the trade name on that was Mevacor. So Lipitor, just in the United States, was prescribed to 29 million adults. Okay, the profit the total sales of Lipitor over 14 years when it went generic was $125 billion. It's like the most successful drug in terms of volume of sales and numbers of patients that were put on it in history. Okay, so Lipitor was touted to lower LDL cholesterol levels, and it does that. It was also touted and marketed to treat and prevent heart attacks, neither of which it does. So the Friday thing is to review that and show you why. Hi, Kevin. So in light of the USDA recommendations for more carbohydrates and less fat, less cholesterol, so Lipitor sales took off. Okay, the generic version is still recommended by physicians all over the United States. When I saw my doctor last May to start working on hypertension, I did my labs. He wanted a CBC and a metabolic profile, and I said, well, let's add some stuff to that. So I was health coaching myself. So I ordered my labs. So that CBC CMP I got for $35, and I added some testosterone labs and PSA and liver enzymes and liver functions, as well as particle size, lipid panel and particle size and all that. So when he looked at it, I still remember him saying this. He looked at me, he goes, your cholesterol sucks. So it was 246. He thought it sucked. He said, I'm going to put you on Lipitor. And so I politely refused and said, I'll take care of it. And we'll talk about that story that I've done twice on Friday on how I reversed that. So I politely refused. I thought about engaging with a little academic debate with this guy, with this doctor, and why I wouldn't take a statin. I decided not to. He's busy. He's got a lot of stuff to do. So before we get into the reasons why statins may not be good for you, let's talk about cholesterol. So here's the science. And once we do the science of cholesterol, when we get to the statin studies, I'll cut off and we'll do the statin studies on Friday. Okay. So first of all, if you had no cholesterol in your body, you would die. I said that in the first part. So 80% of cholesterol production occurs in your liver. Okay, so if your dietary cholesterol intake is only 200 milligrams, which is kind of the average US diet, your body will make 800 milligrams of circulating cholesterol because you need it for your health and well-being. So what you eat is only 1/5 of the cholesterol circulating in your bloodstream or in your body, doing its thing. So to a lesser extent, cholesterol also is produced in the adrenal glands, in your intestines, and your reproductive organs, not as much as the liver. So synthesis, and here's the science, and I'll try to make this as unscientific-y as possible. So synthesis of cholesterol in your body begins with two molecules which are dehydrated. So water is taken away from them to form a molecule called HMG coenzyme A. Okay, so that molecule is reduced to mevalonate. See, chemistry, you guys still can't say them. Mevalonate by an enzyme called HMG coenzyme A reductase. Okay, that is the step that statins block. So it's an irreversible step. So HMG-CoA is converted to mevalonate by that enzyme, and statins block that enzyme. Okay, that leads to lower cholesterol levels. Okay, so cholesterol is a needed precursor in your body. You got to have it to make steroids. All the steroid hormones come from cholesterol through pregnenolone and DHEA, the grandmother and mother of all hormones. Okay, so cortisol, aldosterone, DHEA, the sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and vitamin D all need cholesterol for production. Okay, so you produce 800 milligrams of cholesterol a day in your body. You eat about 200 milligrams. Hey, Terry, Kevin, Stacy, Stephanie, wow. So you eat about 200 milligrams, and your total body content at any one time is about 35 grams. Okay, so a typical way this works is if you eat more cholesterol, your liver makes less. So you're trying to keep that like 35 gram availability for your body, okay? So the body responds to cholesterol intake by reducing synthesis. That's feedback inhibition. We talk about that in physiology all the time. The liver is also involved in excreting cholesterol, and that is where one of the functions of bile is to excrete cholesterol. But you need it so much that about half of it that's excreted in bile is reabsorbed further along the small intestine for reuse. So you're always collecting and saving and making cholesterol despite what you eat, right? So in physiology, the functions of cholesterol are myriad. So it's intimately involved in cell membrane physiology, including synthesis of cell walls. Okay, we talked about that when we talked about the COVID-19, alternative pathophysiology things other than the lung. Okay, so cell wall membrane synthesis requires cholesterol, right? It prevents passage of positively charged ions, so proton, electron positivity and negativity of substances, okay, through the cell membrane, and that's how we maintain a proper acid-base balance and a pH in our body, okay? Molecules of cholesterol are also signalers and transporters in cell membrane physiology. It's involved in conduction along your nerves and engulfment of foreign molecules by your immune system through a process called endocytosis, where the immune system cell actually engulfs what it's trying to get rid of. Okay, so what are the different types? So total cholesterol is a combination, an arithmetic addition problem of the different kinds of cholesterol. Okay, so cholesterol needs a transport mechanism, and this is accomplished by packaging it with carriers called lipoproteins. Okay, so some of the controversy about cholesterol revolves these little particles and what risk they pose. Okay, so I hiked this from somebody, and I would tell you who said it, but I can't remember off the top of my head to give them credit. But somebody called lipoproteins cholesterol taxis. So I think that's a fairly accurate description. They're little taxis, okay? And they're chylomicrons. That's in the chylomicrons are the VLDL, LDL, ILDL, and the HDL that you've heard about. So very low density lipoproteins, intermediate density lipoproteins, low density lipoproteins, and high density lipoproteins. Okay, so chylomicrons are the taxis for triglycerides from what you eat. Okay, so your level of triglyceride, if I measure that, which is on a fasting lipid profile, it will tell me how much fatty acid that you've eaten in the last 3 weeks. So if somebody's trying to do a low fatty acid diet and I measure their triglyceride and it's high, they're actually not lowering their cholesterol intake, okay? So these are the large molecule vehicles or taxis. They're made in the digestive tract. So VLDL is made in the liver and also transports triglycerides. So they're transformed into intermediate sized lipoprotein as the body uses the triglycerides that you've eaten and has been transported by the chylomicrons. Okay, so intermediate density lipoproteins form as triglyceride is removed from very low density lipoproteins, and those are then cleared, those lipoproteins are cleared by the liver. So LDL, low density lipoprotein, is the transport particle that gets the most attention. They're called the bad cholesterol particles, right? They deliver a purer cholesterol to your body in the taxi. So less triglycerides that have already been extracted from the 2 prior taxis, right? And so elevation of LDL has been associated with an increased risk of heart attack and stroke. We'll talk about that Friday. And then HDL, or high density lipoproteins, or what most people call the good cholesterol, is the transport vehicle or taxi that removes cholesterol from the blood and delivers it to the liver for excretion. Okay. It also removes cholesterol from arterial walls. And we talked about chronic inflammation and coronary heart disease, I think on Friday. We're going to revisit that on Friday again. Okay. Okay. It also, HDL is considered protected at levels above 60. And so women, so that's felt to reduce the risk of heart attack and stroke. So women tend to have a higher HDL than men. Most of the men that I test are right around 40, sometimes lower than that. Women are almost always over 50, so they have less heart disease risk until they get to menopause and they don't take their hormones. Then their heart disease risk increases, okay, to the level of a man's by age 65. So when you get a fasting lipid panel test, blood test, the result will give you the volumes of those 4 types of cholesterol. So usually what's measured in a fasting lipid profile is total cholesterol, triglycerides, LDL, and HDL cholesterol. Some include VLDL cholesterol, with the total cholesterol level being the sum of the other types, okay? So frequently, like health fairs do this all the time, they'll measure a total cholesterol level. That tells you absolutely nothing. Doesn't help at all. And I'm going to prove it to you. So frequently, if you have a cholesterol over 200, you're told that you have hypercholesterolemia or hyperlipidemia. It's an actual diagnosis. I mean, it's a hugely used diagnostic code. Okay, so let's say you have a total cholesterol measurement of 221. Okay, the goal being less than 200. Okay, so if you had an LDL cholesterol level of 100, which is ideal, right, with a very low density lipoprotein cholesterol level of 35, and normal is less than 40, combined with an HDL cholesterol level of 86, remember, ideal is over 60. If you add those together, you get a cholesterol level of 221. And that's a pretty good lipid panel according to the American Heart Association, right? So you need to figure out really the mixture of cholesterols which make up the total cholesterol level so you can really look at this closer. And then even more than that, and I learned this from a cardiology buddy of mine who consulted on a patient of mine that was 37 and had a heart attack. Her cholesterol level, I think, was 600 and something, and her triglyceride level was 3,000 and something. Like, I drew her blood and it came out orange instead of red. It was interesting. Anyway, he taught me about particle size, and this was 15, 20 years ago. So particle size is part of it. And then there's a genetic component that actually can be measured now. We'll talk about that Friday as well. So the total cholesterol level is just one little part of the picture. Okay, so what's the controversy? So if a person is only eating 20% of their total body cholesterol, and the body's producing 80% of what's circulating, restricting dietary intake of cholesterol really shouldn't make that much difference. It's only 20%, right? So if you consume more cholesterol, your body's production of cholesterol will lower in response. That's negative feedback inhibition, okay? So how would cholesterol from the diet be related to heart disease, heart attack, and stroke? Okay, what is debatable is that the role of blood cholesterol levels play in these diseases and whether or not cholesterol-lowering statins actually reduce heart disease rates, mortality, and increase life expectancy. So CV disease, cardiovascular, leading cause of death in the US every year, has been for years and years and years, all the way back to those early dietary guidelines. So in medical school, I was taught about inflammation from the Framingham Heart Study, which began in 1948. It's in its 3rd generation, still going on. Over 14,000 people that they followed for years and years and years, finding high blood pressure and high cholesterol to be major risk factors for heart disease. Okay, that was the first time anybody looked. I mean, doctors didn't know what caused heart disease before the Framingham study. So it led physicians like when you go to the doctor to check your blood pressure, check your cholesterol, check your smoking history, talk about your unhealthy eating patterns, physical inactivity, and unhealthy weight levels. Okay, so in a review, the World Journal of Cardiology found that blood cholesterol distributions were similar in the original Framingham study, okay, whether or not participants had coronary heart disease. So they were basically the same. Okay. The only statistically significant difference between the two groups was if the cholesterol was higher than 380. And remember, it's supposed to be less, it's ideally under 200. So they couldn't achieve statistical difference in rates of heart disease in that study unless the cholesterol level was greater than 380, so higher risk, or if the cholesterol was lower than 150, lower cardiovascular risk. Everybody in between had the same risk. So in other words, the association of cholesterol with heart disease did not necessarily imply causation. So cholesterol, we've been told cholesterol causes heart disease, and that World Journal of Cardiology kind of relooked at the statistics and proved that maybe it's not the causative agent. In fact, so 72 dietary studies, a review and analysis was published in 2014, and that study concluded that reduction of dietary saturated fat had no effect on death rates from heart disease. Okay, so there's lots of drugs that will lower your cholesterol levels. Hey, Kurt, none of them show a reduction in cardiac deaths. Like I said, Friday we'll talk about those. The American Heart Association guidelines conclude that none of these drugs will lower the mortality from heart disease, and drugs that lower cholesterol levels, including niacin, fibrates, bile sequestrants, and the statins. So there's a whole bunch of them that you can do. Niacin, of course, is over the counter. The rest of them are prescription only. So that leads to statin studies and statin research and their association with cardiovascular risk of death and just heart disease in general. And we're going to talk about that on Friday. Okay, so that's what I got for today, this morning. Remember, Friday, the Art of Floundering podcast with Wynn Richards. We'll be doing Zoom live, stream to Facebook Live, question and answer. So you guys, if you want to join that, just look up his podcast on Facebook, Art of Floundering, the Art of Floundering podcast. And we'll be on there Friday about 7, I think. And if it's different, I'll put something up on Facebook. Okay, thanks for joining. I did it in 37 minutes. We got at least that much to go on Friday. And I'll see you Friday at 9:30. Have a great day. See you later. Bye.